closing food banks, that's the stupidest idea.
That is insane.
Like, something's got to be done. You can't carry on.
It's something I've been wrestling with.
We're in this together.
The awful fact is, people need you. I think it's one of the most interesting questions you can ask about it. Actually, big change can happen. Sometimes people will unhelpfully jump on that as a solution, and it can take attention off of what is just the main driver, which is becoming more and more extreme, is just the fact that people haven't got enough money.
Thanks for joining us for the HUBLIFE podcast. We've been having conversations about ending the need for food bank for the last few weeks, and we are very excited today. In fact, we're thrilled today to have with us to continue the conversation. We've got Garry Lemon from the Trussell Trust. Welcome.
Woo!
Thank you ever so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
Cool.
All right, well, I think the best place to start would be for you to tell everybody who's watching, Garry, who you are, what you do, what your role is, what that involves, how long you've been at the Trussell Trust, but I am going to say keep it short. So you got a minute, ready?
Okay, that's just, I need to remember my job title first as well.
I know, it's quite long.
It's quite long. It is long.
I always forget it. So I'm Garry Lemon, and I'm the Director of Strategic Engagement at the Trussell Trust. I've been there for about 6 years. And really my job is now about connecting different audiences with the strategy to end the need for food banks. So it might be you guys in the food bank network, it might be our own staff at the Trussell Trust. So I suppose for people watching, we're in slightly different organisations, aren't we? So you're part of the wider network, and I sit at the kind of the organisation, the national organisation, that's the kind of the umbrella group, and the general public as well. So yeah, that's kind of my job.
And that rounds it up for us.
Yeah, and that's like a minute. He's professional.
Done this before.
Far more professional than us. So Trussell has, for those guys who are watching and don't know, that Trussell's encouraged effectively all of the local food banks to get behind and take on board the new vision of ending the need for food banks in the UK. But I wonder if you could share perhaps some of the key initiatives and strategies that Trussell have done, rather than what the local food banks decisions have made and things that we've done that we might talk about today. But some of the strategies that Trussell themselves have implemented centrally to work towards achieving the goal.
Yeah. So it's been a kind of a journey to get to where we are today, where we've got, so there are more than 420 separate organisations that are Trussell Trust food banks in the network right across the UK, about sort of more than 1,400 physical centres. So it's a really big network. And I suppose, maybe it's helpful to talk about why and how we started moving towards this goal to end the need. Because sort of 5 or 6 years ago when I started, I think it wouldn't be too harsh to say that sort of essentially we didn't really have a strategy, so to speak. I think there were different voices within the organisation, and some were kind of understandably, I think, we're talking about just building kind of the biggest and best food bank network that we possibly could. And I really get it. It's like when I go to visit food banks and speak to people who give up their time to volunteer or work in them, the overriding thing that drives them is a sense of kind of compassion and wanting to practically help people in their society. So when I moved to Trussell Trust, I'd been working at a homelessness charity beforehand for a long time, for about 10 years. So I was used to feeling, and people kind of seeing me as extremely worthy. He works for a homeless charity. He's really, really good.
He's a nice man.
Yeah, he's so
people
noble.
applaud you everywhere you went.
Pretty much, yeah. Like mates who are investment bankers who I didn't want to show. And for the first time when I started, it was like a new experience for me. I was getting criticised from people in the States and from people in Scotland. Those two great nations stick in my line. And it was a new experience. And the criticism was about, particularly from the States, was really interesting because what they were trying to say to us, and there's an author called Andy Fisher, actually, who was kind of the driving force behind this, was that look at what's happened over here in the US. you've got this food bank industry almost, where you have it's worth billions of dollars. You know, every state's got this like huge, massive multi-story warehouse, and it's completely entrenched here. And looking over the Atlantic, looking at what's happened in the UK, and particularly, you know, I think the Trussell Trust being the largest food bank network, but certainly not the only one. We were kind of the lightning rod for that sort of criticism. And he had written a book called The Hunger Industrial Complex, which a few of us at Trussell read. And yeah, it really sort of knocked me for six slightly. And so I think that after that, and again, as people in Scotland as well had a really similar kind of take, and were also quite critical of us. And we kind of took it on board, and we sort of over quite a rapid period actually, we had our new chief executive kind of come in who sort of changed the direction. And most importantly, we tried to have like conversations with people in the network to say, listen, this is what people are saying, and we kind of think that there's some justification for the fact that they're saying that we're on a road where it will be difficult to turn back from.
Can I ask, were them conversations happening before Emma took over then? Like, or did she spearhead that change of vision, or was it already bubbling under, you know, the things you're talking about? Were they already happening before that changeover?
Yeah, the criticism was definitely happening.
But not how we're going to resolve it.
Yes, yeah, exactly. I think that it was really interesting seeing a kind of and I suppose a bit like being part of a change of leadership and a change of direction in the organisation. And, you know, like Trussell Trust Central has grown and changed an awful lot since I started sort of 5-6 years ago. And yeah, it's been, I think, it was interesting having those kind of first early chats with people in the food bank network. I was almost like nervous to speak to people and say, look, listen, I know that you've sweat blood and tears over this place. Yeah. You've given up your own time. You've built this incredible little organisation in your community. And now I'm like coming along saying, do you want to just like end it all? Yeah. And people were almost like universally receptive to that idea. I think even by that point, 5 or 6 years ago, you see enough people in your own community like coming through the doors of a food bank that you begin to think that actually, do you know what, like something's got to be done. We can't carry on just pulling people out of the river, and we need to find out why they're falling in. So yeah, that's kind of...
Yeah, that's a good overview of the start. So then with regard to like the key strategies or things that Trussell have implemented centrally.
Oh yes, yeah. There was an actual question you asked me, which I completely like went around.
You've done a politician on us.
No, because I think there have been many. Because we're part of the network. We know what's going on. We know some of what's going on and things we've accessed. So yeah, just some of the things like even the strategic grants, all the things where Trussell are trying to help the local food banks, not just saying get on with it. They're actually resourcing local food banks to try and centre their provision of trying to end it rather than just grow it. And so maybe there's some I don't know about as well, but some of the key strategies and key initiatives that you've already put in place over the last couple of years.
Sure. So centrally we built our strategy around kind of 3 broad themes, which we and I should say that we kind of made the strategy hand in hand with the food bank network. So it's centered around changing minds, changing communities, and changing policy. And what we've tried to do is kind of enact programs centrally through that, but also increasingly we've tried to like push those 3 strands out through all of the food banks in the network. And it's a big old beast, the Trust Food Bank. You know, as I say, it's like tens of thousands of volunteers, lots of separate organisations. So one of the strategic initiatives that we undertook is something called the Pathfinder programme, where we decided not to like try and do everything with all food banks at once, although all food banks are welcome to get on board with the strategy. But we kind of jointly decided on, I think it's 59 food banks, which we would kind of fund more intensively and put more support around, really to like experiment with, okay, so like centrally changing policy might be somebody speaking to the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions about benefits. But locally, at a food bank, that might mean finding out in your local council who is the cabinet member responsible for like local welfare payments, for example. So we thought that there was a kind of a symmetry there between like the national and the local. So we've got lots of food banks now who we've funded with grant money. We always try to ensure that money that's donated to the Trussell Trust, a decent proportion of that flows to food banks in local communities. And that's done things like fund new roles at food banks whereby you could bring in expertise or just extra hands on deck to do things like, okay, who is at the council? Who can we speak to? And it's been really fascinating and like quite humbling actually to go around lots of different food banks in the UK and see them actually, you know, getting their heads down and trying things.
Yeah, well, we've accessed the financial inclusion grant scheme, and so we talked about it in a few the last episodes of. So we've got CA workers in all of our sites now. Only just started really only a few months, but hoping to see the fruit from that in the longest term. So yeah, you mentioned there sort of central government and local authority. What role do you believe policymakers, either centrally or locally, will play or should play in addressing the root causes of food poverty? How big a piece of the pie are they, do you think? I know that's, maybe in the Trussell Trust there's different answers to that question, but just you in individually, what do you think, how much of the pie is policy? Because there's the three strands to the vision, and how much of it is policy based, do you think? How much of the pie do you think we can impact through that route?
It's a really, really important part of the pie. I personally think it's a really big part of the pie, but it's not the whole pie. I'll get hungry.
Yeah. We like you. Did someone say pie?
Yeah. So our research really clearly shows that you've got kind of like three main drivers for the need for food banks. And the reason why we, like in the last financial year as a network, over the past financial year have given out more emergency food parcels than we ever have, more than 3 million.
More than 3 million?
Yeah.
Oh, I thought it was 2.9. Oh,
no, you might be right actually. We're like it's almost exactly 3 million.
Right.
It's around there. Yeah. But it's a lot.
Yeah.
And it's more than we ever have. Even
during COVID,
yeah.
I think it was 2.7 or something like that, wasn't it? It's even higher than...
You've done your maths, haven't you? You've done your numbers today.
Yeah, you've got them in your head better than me.
Put
me to shame. But the kind of main driver of the three is the benefits system, social security, not either providing enough money to meet people's essential needs or not providing money in a timely enough way, or a kind of a combination of the two.
Yeah.
And obviously those the levels that benefits are set at are political decisions, chiefly through Westminster government, but also local government has got a part to play in that as well. So depending on where you are in the UK, so like here in England, you've got things like the local welfare scheme, which we kind of centrally, along with food banks, successfully campaigned for, which is now being administered in hundreds of different ways by hundreds of different local authorities.
We talked to a Norfolk County councillor about this issue, and before COVID, there was a huge percentage of local authorities that didn't have them at all. Yeah. And so so maybe a lot of that pressure through Trussell has helped, but maybe one good thing coming from COVID might have shone a spotlight on that issue of local welfare and needing it as well. Yeah.
But as well, in COVID, you had the £20 uplift to universal credit and the standard rate, which was massive. Yeah. And again, was another thing that we all called for really strongly. So I think that though it was awful in a lot of ways, COVID, it did also sort of highlight ways that actually big change can happen in a way which before I honestly wouldn't have imagined that you would see like 20 quid on the standard rate, but we did see it.
Yeah, and I know obviously Trussell with Joseph Rowntree are really pushing for the Guarantee Our Essentials campaign, which is an even bigger uplift, I believe, proportionately than that over COVID. And we've talked about it to some extent on the podcast already, but so it's something that the viewers would be aware of. So in your opinion, if you take, let's take benefits off the table, what do you think are some of the biggest issues that are not that that we could get our teeth into and really make a difference, either nationally or locally for each individual food bank? Like your top three, have you got sort of things that the Trussell are really sort of honing in and got their eyes on the target, or things we can actually do that make the biggest difference in the shortest term, or what's the play?
That's a really good question, and I think it's one of the most interesting questions you can ask about it. If people have got enough money for the essentials, then what else is needed and what else should be there? I mean, our research also shows that, like alongside just not having enough cash, a lack of local or informal support is also a huge factor that drives people to needing food banks. And to be honest, I think it's an area where we need to get more evidence and more information about. And I think, rightly we've concentrated on the biggest driver, but I think there's a really interesting question to ask. If you end the need for food banks, then in a way you're kind of ending the need for emergency food. I think though that there are other things that food banks and kind of wider community and things like church or youth groups or, other kind of local community institutions do that are difficult to quantify in terms of money, but I think are, and our research shows this, are actually really important in keeping people resilient. So I think, one of the interesting exercises that food banks do sometimes as part of the strategy is to kind of envisage what does a world look like, what does a Thetford look like without the need for food banks. Partly, yes, it will be people have got enough money to afford the essentials, but I also think part of it is you've got like a network of support that you can reach out to, like be it friends, be it wider family, be it other groups, and like going completely off research and completely off script now, but I do feel that like society is increasingly becoming more kind of atomized and people are getting lonelier. Well, there is plenty of research that shows that, and find it difficult to reach out to people, and that is another important.
And them things sort of girder the rest of your life, don't they? And like if them things aren't functioning, you often then aren't particularly necessarily make good choices with finances anyway, even if you had enough coming in, because you've got so much else going on. And I suppose that's the danger of closing food banks, if you like, is that food banks aren't just food banks, are they? You know that as much as us, that they play such a bigger role than that. They don't just provide food, and Trussell for many years were trying to sort of make that part of each food bank is more than food. And I think so much of it is social, and it's like the danger, I suppose, is removing the need for the food bank, and then there's a big vacuum left of support that food banks would have provided, on a day-to-day basis for probably the most vulnerable in our society, in our experience. And so I suppose, like, I have to think about us as a local food bank, but maybe from a national point of view, is the shrinking of let's say, food bank not really the closing down of Trussell Trust, but a remorphing into a different provision rather than emergency food provision, all the other provisions on top of that aren't essential, let's say, even though perhaps you could argue many of them are essential. But are we seeing perhaps a morph of Trussell Trust and the food bank network into something that is just not food provision, or the closing of it completely? So it's something I've been wrestling with in our local food bank. So I'm sure nationally that conversation must happen.
So I think for a local food bank, a lot of cases, you're going to have to, if we're successful, which is, like we've got a mountain to climb still at the moment.
We're swimming upstream.
Yes. But, we're not without hope. But yeah, definitely, I think that lots of food banks will, without having to give charity food to people in the community, that resource of dedicated people, incredibly well organised volunteers, people with the skills to sit and have a non-judgmental conversation with someone who will have been pushed from institutional pillar to post. There's definitely going to be a need and a place for that after the need for emergency food is gone. So I think that at food bank level, there are definitely interesting conversations to have about what should we change into in this new world. And actually, if you want to be strategically successful, it's quite important to have that kind of end goal in mind, because it will affect your decisions now. But our policy centrally is that we, in Trussell Trust, won't be needed. We are quite serious about the fact that we will put ourselves out of business, which I tell my other half that if we're successful, I'll be wildly employable. So don't worry about that. But but I certainly don't think it means that the disappearance of everything that's been built in different communities, just the disappearance of need for charity food.
Right, that's interesting, because I was unsure whether Trussell would just morph into doing what it does still, which isn't actual direct food provision. It organises a network of people who do food provision, but among other things. So I wasn't sure if it would just operate in the same manner, but without the food provision, if possible. So that's answered my question. That's just a personal.
No, it's a fair question, and I suppose it's one. I hope we've always been quite sort of set on putting ourselves out of business, genuinely. But maybe it's something we need to think about a bit more.
Yeah. We had two guests on. One was a county councillor, and one was a lady called Carly who works in supported housing. And we asked them about what the one biggest thing was that they thought would make the biggest impact. And it wasn't benefits for them. For them, because of their experience, obviously, they thought it was more to do with life skills. Are the biggest driver, and getting ahead of the curve, perhaps, and really sort of highlighting the importance of perhaps them skill sets being taught in the education system. And so, with Carly particularly working with individuals in supported housing, finding they just don't have the simplest skills to do. Like she even said, changing a bed, let alone complex financial decisions.
Writing a CV.
Telephone conversations with an employer, all these sorts of things that they need help with. And, I think generally speaking, we think in society that's a parent's role, but often that's perhaps not happening to the level it should for whatever reason. And so, but then we had another guest who thought that being placed on the education system, they've already overwhelmed, So I wonder, do Trussell have any plans to be in the education system? Although I read today, I believe, that there's a game out, isn't there? A board game that's for primary school children. I believe that. I think I read that today. I think that was from Trussell.
This is so exciting for me. What sort of game? I like the game.
This might be news to me as well. Maybe I didn't get the ball.
Is it the Trussell Trust game or?
I think just to highlight some of the issues around food bank and food poverty. But so obviously there is, movements into the education system. But I don't know how much of that do you think, if we're thinking it's not going to happen in 5 years, because are we halfway through the 5 year?
I think it's fair to say we're not, barring some miracle, we're not going to end the need in 5 years.
Yeah, and many people might think it's much longer term, and if we're heading in that direction, then great. If it takes us 20 years, but we get there, then great. But for that, perhaps getting into the education system might be. I'm an ex-teacher, by the way, so I don't know what your thoughts are about that, or if any plans of Trussell. Maybe you don't know, but just sort of get your thoughts on that.
So, in general, our approach is that we try to look at the things. We're sort of super data and evidence led, centrally. So resources like State of Hunger or. I suppose by the time publication we would have put out a new kind of flagship research, which is called Hunger in the UK, which is kind of a broad evidence base about what's happening, why do people need food banks, and if you've got the information, then you can begin to think about the answers. And our approach has always been to like look at the kind of the main drivers and really focus on them. And then when you get issues that are really important, but perhaps aren't like the super main drivers, so absolutely things like education or housing, we've got like amazing organisations around us already. So our policy has been one of central issues. We'll kind of throw time, resource, thought and strategy at it. Issues which are peripheral makes them sound unimportant. That's not the case. They're really important.
Maybe the ones that you can't have the biggest impact in.
Exactly. You know, like why kind of wade into housing too much when what we could do is like provide evidence and support to shelter or crisis or, you know, the National Housing Federation, who are more expert and have got more kind of pull in that sector. And likewise with education, you know, we do have good relationships with schools, but in terms of things like skills, etc., you know, I think that there are other organisations that are like better placed to do that, and we'll share info and data with them.
Yeah, for them organisations to put pressure on either central government or the local authorities in charge of schools to implement certain policies that might have a bigger change. But I suppose if they've got more clout than you in that area, you know, they've got more credibility in that particular zone, and that makes sense.
Yeah. And I suppose as well, I'm always really kind of cautious, because when you begin to like rightly talk about things like people not having all of the life skills that they might need to be successful, then I think sometimes people like will unhelpfully like jump on that as a solution, and it can take attention off of what is just the main driver, which is becoming more and more extreme, is just the fact that people haven't got enough money coming in. And I can see why people say, well, yeah, but you know, people haven't got the skills. We've got to begin to having like difficult conversations about the fact that it doesn't really matter whether you can or can't cook if you can't afford the food, or indeed the heating or the lighting or the winter clothes, you know. So yeah, you know, on a personal level.
Yeah. So I guess what would happen then perhaps is that knocking down the first skill of have people having enough money, and say that takes a 20% chunk out of the use, or 30 or 40, is then like, what's the next thing that we can do to make the biggest difference for our amount of time or energy or resource or funding that we throw at it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. On that note then, so I wanted to ask about the potential sustainability. Can you discuss any concerns about the sustainability of like the resources and funding required to support the long-term goal? Because I was thinking about this just this morning, that I suppose, let's say we're locally and nationally becoming very successful, and the network's shrinking and the food bank use is shrinking, all of a sudden it becomes not as big a problem, which then doesn't attract as much funding and support and to then maintain the solutions to that problem. And so like, I was thinking about that. I was like, how do we get around that we don't slowly tip down and then support and money dries up, you know, like strategic grants and all that sort of thing that are actually making a difference on the ground, and then disappearing, and then just the usage goes back up. Is there any sort of, I suppose it's such a big such a big problem to think about.
Yeah, and it's quite, in a way, it's quite a nice one to think about, because you know, my kind of day to day is just quite doom and gloom at the moment, just in terms of like what the kind of the short to medium term at the very least looks like. I suppose I would hope that in a world where need for food banks is reducing, and you know, things like food insecurity are falling lower on the kind of the national register of what people are interested in, I would hope that food banks and Trussell kind of centrally have been able to kind of equip ourselves and you guys in the network to be able to deal with that kind of an environment. You know, the fact that we're kind of here sitting around a table doing like a super impressive and professional podcast says to me that, you know, you're people who can do a decent like trust application, or be able to reach out to your community and say,
He obviously doesn't know us very well.
Speak for yourself.
I mean, actually, I would absolutely fail at doing it. Just 100% say. But yeah, I know I've seen the food bank network battle through far worse than that.
Yeah.
You know, like I've got faith that you'll be able to deal with it.
Yeah, and I think that is good, because I think it appears to me with the strategic grants and support, it isn't like this is what we want to. We don't want to prop you up forever. No. You're saying, here's a direction to run in. Here's some resource to get you going. Yeah. Now you run with it and keep going. So perhaps that'll mitigate that risk. Halfway down the journey, and the food banks can carry on the momentum that the Century Trussell have started. And that'd be the hope anyway. You mentioned there about in the day-to-day it's doom and gloom because of the short to medium term, particularly within the cost of living crisis. So with regard to that, because we joked about it and we laugh about it because it's the only way we can sort of perhaps process it, is that we joke that we started a year and a half ago on this mission to reduce food bank numbers, and we've 56% increased just this year alone, and so it feels like we're failing locally and nationally if you just look at the data. And so I guess I want to ask is how do we, or how do you measure the success when what metrics can we use to track progress? Because from my point of view, if we hadn't done anything, then perhaps the numbers would be even greater. Yeah. So it's incredibly difficult to measure how successful your actual strategy is when the economics of the world, are out of our control. And so, other than numbers, are there any other metrics to measure the success?
Good question, and not an easy one. I've worked in the charity sector for 20 years, and I've often said to people, I won't swear, but
you can. I'll bleep it out.
That's right, I'll bleep it out. Don't worry.
She's doing it all the time.
I can't help it.
A lot of the time, it feels like I'm just making things slightly less shit than they would have been.
Yeah.
Which is a really negative way of looking at it. I also think before you get to things like measurement, I think that there's a moral imperative about the fact that yes, we're at the bottom of a mountain, or not at the bottom, you guys. You're doing stuff now, so you're beginning to climb that mountain. Yes, it's getting bigger at the moment, but I think there's something really fundamentally important to be said about the fact that at least you're not just stood at the bottom, not even trying. Yeah. You've got what the summit looks like, and you're thinking about it, and you're working towards it. I think that matters. It really matters, and it will affect the decisions that you make. I remember we could have potentially made decisions early on, we should just build a massive lorry park like we've got in the States, and we could do a deal with Eddie Stobart, and I bet we'd have had a load of corporates on board just to build an incredibly massive Trussell Trust branded trucks and everything. And we didn't, and we would have been further away from the goal if we hadn't done that. So I think that's an important thing to say. I would also say that the fact that you're getting financial inclusion work in, you're getting CA advisors in, even if you change one family's life for the better, I think that matters. I think that's really important. I think that's an extraordinary thing to do. In terms of measuring, ultimately it comes down to things like, it does come down to numbers to a degree. So I think the fact that you've got a financial inclusion service in means that you can say, we've seen X amount of people, they've been able to access Y amount of money. Yeah. It matters to be able to have the numbers and to be able to talk about the impact. And then, then you can move on to things like, okay, so how many people have we seen one time? How many people have we seen 2 times, 3 times? Can we reduce repeat visits, etc.? Yeah. So I think that there are interesting ways to do it, but you're right, you're always at the mercy of the wider tides of policy and economy, and you have to be able to try to remove those big factors out and try to have a sensible look at, okay, fine, if we're in this little boat in this big ocean, are we rowing in the right direction?
Yeah, and doing the things that we can do locally, even if, because in your analogy of we're make a first few steps up the mountain, and we can see the summit. I suppose in that analogy, the summit's getting higher at a quicker rate than we're catching up, and so it feels like we're in real terms going backwards. But I appreciate your point, because we don't feel discouraged by it, because we know the amount of effort we're putting in, and we're going to see some fruits from that anyway. I suppose I'm trying to encourage other food banks as well to carry on or to start that journey, even if they think it's too far.
Impossible.
Because I think people thought it was probably impossible to climb Everest before someone done it, and so we'll keep stepping in the right direction, hopefully. As we head towards the goal of ending the need for food banks, do you think there are any potential risks or unintended consequences? Because we've talked to a few people, and most people are really on board with it, but often say, but this could be a downside of it, or a negative. Have you got any thoughts about what could potentially crop up? I know they're unintended, but it doesn't mean we can't foresee them, if you know what I mean.
It's another good and tough question, that.
I'm sorry, I'm not here to grill you.
No one's ever going to come back from Trussell. That's Phil.
No, I will be all right on news night if I can get through this.
You can get to us, Phil.
Yeah. It'll be a Paxman, will be no problem.
But can I just say though, I am genuinely intrigued with it. This is not like a gotcha question. I'm actually, I'm really trying to learn of how we can do this.
We want to do it better.
Yeah, when we're tasked with something, we as a couple, it's like, if we're going to do it, we're going to do it. Yeah. And so I am actually really interested in the answers, as opposed to just create a YouTube channel.
Yeah, and I do have one actually. So something which I'm worried about personally, and I think organisationally we're worried about as well, is if we give the mission of ending the need for food banks to clearly talented, extremely motivated people like yourself. What if? What if you then run off and you try to just do absolutely everything in your community to tackle, do the whole anti-poverty shebang? Advice, mental health support, etc., etc., etc. I think that there are potential hazards with that. I mean, just your own sort of mental health and capacity.
As well, Garry, so there's just no way.
But B, I think in the current situation we're in, and I don't know how you're seeing things here, but you've got lots of local services are struggling at the moment. Statutory services, government services, other charities, advice services. They're really, really struggling. And they don't have the advantage of being part of a network or being able to kind of access grants and stuff. And it does worry me that a really amazing, motivated food bank could just come in and take all of that over. And I think that would be, alongside the resource question, it would be kind of a shame, because I care about diversity within community, diversity of organisations and stuff. And
I suppose the danger is if local food banks get really good at substance abuse advice, debt advice, all that, and then they close, then the infrastructure's gone for that town. If it's all reliant on that one organisation rather than multiple organisations that have funding streams from different places. So that is a risk, isn't it? Yeah,
absolutely. And it's why we kind of have encouraged food banks who we've kind of been really close behind to say, look, listen, please map out all of your partners that are there. Don't double up on services that are already being offered. Make sure you work in partnership. I think that one of the most important and unique things about the Trussell Trust and about the Food Bank Network is the fact that you know your community and you know your services and you're trusted. You've earned the right to speak to people in your community and they will listen. That isn't just me saying it because I feel that, although I do. It's also the evidence shows. If you look at who do people trust in their community, their local food bank is pretty much at the top. So you've got this opportunity to find out who's there and people listen to you, and this kind of definitely an opportunity to look at the system around you and bring people together to say, look, can we make this bit of the system work differently? Absolutely. But it makes me nervous if all food banks were just to begin to like blob out and just take over those systems, you know.
Can you, maybe you don't want to answer this, but I'll answer it anyway, and we can edit it out if you don't want to answer it, but can you discuss any potential resistance or pushback that you've encountered from various stakeholders, be that within the network or outside of the network? Because like you said, you've had criticism from people from Scotland and the States for the fact that, you know, food banks exist or that they're growing or big, but I'm sure we've had pushback internally, externally from people who are like, closing food banks, that's the stupidest idea in ever, because, you know, people just express their views all the time when they don't, particularly when they don't understand the motives and the drivers behind it as well. And so, have you had any of that pushback? And even internally, I was really interested about like the dynamic of when it started to change in the leadership, because I know as leaders of an organisation how hard it is to change, you know, just tacking somewhere different, let alone feeling like you're doing 180s. And so, like, all of that, you know, has been difficult to navigate, I'd imagine.
So, like, to the first part of the question, I mean, obviously, you know, if you're dealing with a network of like 20,000 volunteers and I think thousands of like employees, it took some people like time to come along with the journey, and I'm sure that there are some who quite possibly don't agree. Although I would definitely say that I've been surprised at how little disagreement and pushback like we've experienced from within the network. I think that sometimes a challenge with like organisational change that you're kind of pointing to is just communicating things, you know, particularly like strategic direction. It can be hard. And I know in food banks that, you know, it's easy enough. Well, it's not always easy, you know, things like groups like trustees, for example, bringing them on board might be difficult if they see a food bank as part of like a church's outreach into the community in a really practical way, then that can cause challenges and has done. You've got like volunteers who, like, absolutely fair enough, like they like to come in, they want to date the cans, they want to stack the shelves, they get a feeling of fulfillment from doing that, and I 100% respect that. And they don't want to get involved in the kind of the people like me coming in, you know, like stroking my beard, wanting to like have strategic conversations about the direction of the food bank.
I'm sorting beans.
Yeah, no, exactly. And like, do you know what? Like, go for your life. The beans do need sorting.
Yes, they do.
But I do think that actually it does matter. That you need to, in any kind of organisation, like, you know, be it like a charity or like a big multinational or, you know, food bank, you've got to show leadership and you've got to bring people along on the journey. We've actually started to kind of provide advice and resources in terms of like ways to be able to speak to like volunteers in particular about, you know, if this is the direction we're going in. And it's not always easy. And as well, it's not always like me in central office who has to have these difficult conversations. I don't know whether like you've had to have any or whether
we do have to have them difficult conversations. And it's funny you said, because we've had a vision night for our volunteers because we felt it was really important to make sure all our volunteers were going in the right direction. And it was...
And frame the vision in a way that's palatable. Like...
Because a lot of them were like, that is insane, like what on earth? But I think having presented it in a way where we were like, we're in this together, because it's very important to me, particularly as the food bank manager, is to be like, we are in this together, we are a family, we're going to do this together. And so having that vision night made a huge difference to our volunteers, and actually I think gave them a bit more enthusiasm and excitement about coming to food bank to sort the beans.
And I think maybe I took a lead from Trussell's playbook, because I think when it first came out it was very gently, even though it was a big bold vision, it was like, you know, my analogy was trying to turn a ship around, and for me it was like, I've joked a bit, but it's like, as long as people are paddling in the same direction, like, because I'm sure half of our volunteers will say, never going to happen. But if we could half it, and we're heading in that direction, then I'm like, then great, you're traveling in the same direction, so that's cool. And I think perhaps a lot of the network is like that. There'll be people, we've been in trustee meetings, regional ones, and there's disagreement across food banks about how it can happen, when it can happen, why it can happen, should it happen. Like you said, even the church thing of providing for the needy, and it's quite a political one as well, isn't it? Like, we've had two separate people say, is government supposed to do everything? And that's a very big political question for an apolitical organisation to battle with. And so and it's one that I had an internal battle with initially as well. It's like, how much of this is government responsibility, how much is it society's responsibility? And I suppose Trussell have come down on one side of the fence on that, particularly, and
to a degree. And to be clear, it's like, we're not apolitical. We're not party political. So we can absolutely criticise a policy. It's just that we can't come down on a side of a particular political party or not. But definitely, it's not about government doing everything. It is about getting the balance right. And I feel that we've been a bit like the proverbial boiling frog, where you've had policy change really radically since 2010, to be frank. You've had tens of billions of pounds taken out of social security, and if you compare the UK to G7 countries and other European neighbours, the replacement rate of salary to social security is way lower in the UK. And I think that it was designed to happen over a period of years. And I don't think we quite realise how radical the policy has been. And yet here we are. Here you are seeing what was it, a 50% increase over the past year. I mean, of course, because of policy decisions mainly, but it also comes back to what we were talking about before. It's about relationships, it's about community, it's about people who pull together and look after one another in ways which is more than just making sure they've got enough money. It's about things like education, it's about things like housing. It's a balance, but it's so off kilter at the moment now that I'll always go on about the money first, I suppose.
Well, particularly with the cost of living crisis, it's exacerbated that issue, and maybe that uplift that Guarantee Your Essentials wouldn't have been that much before this. It'd have been what some might argue a more reasonable level of increase or whatever. But again, it's political. I don't really want to get into that conversation. So how do we balance the urgency of addressing immediate food need with the long-term goal? Like, us as a food bank, how much time and energy we put into both of them things? Because I suppose nationally you can be incredibly focused on the long-term goal, where we can't do that without all the time without a ball dropping, let's say. And so I wondered how centrally what feels like it's long-term strategic and what's just keeping the thing going.
Well, it's funny. I'll share this podcast to our ops director Linda, who would as an organisation, we also take the running of food banks mega seriously, and in terms of resource and staff, our ops directorate are amazing and do a lot of really practical support on the ground. Hi Linda, if you want to. So you've got to do while you're needed. You've got to do it well. You've got to do it properly. And I would never want you to skimp on that basic service because you're concentrating too much on the looking ahead. The sad fact, the awful fact is that people need you, and they need you to offer this service and offer it well. So that's got to come first. And I would say it's almost the most important thing at the moment, sadly. But then I hope some of the support that we can give you gives you the the time and the resource to be able to look ahead as well on top of that. And I suppose that's down to you, isn't it? It's about how well you can organise yourselves and your time and your volunteers, etc., to be able to do that stuff on top. I suppose, though, the last thing I'd say on this is that increasingly we want to try to like remove that division between the operational and the strategic.
Yeah.
I think to do things really well, you can make the operational can be strategic, and likewise the strategic can be operational.
That's what we've tried to do, I guess, and what Steph's tried to do, I think, is doing a good job in, is that even she's both the project manager and the strategic lead. And so, like, because I talked to Joe, our area manager, and I was like, these are, to me, inseparable. They're not two different roles and two different teams. They are one thing, if it's the vision. And so we've tried to amalgamate them, amalgamate, and then into one role. And I think that's worked for us. And getting the balance right is difficult and has been difficult. But I think you are right that the food provision needs to be done. That needs to be ticked off, rather than focusing on other auxiliary things like a podcast.
Yes. Yeah.
So with that then, so finally our tagline for the show and our channel is something's got to change. And so I suppose what I'd like you to do is give our viewers some advice or a message that you can share with them that's Trussell's vision and how they can take action and how they can make that change for the need that needs to happen in their food banks in their community.
Okay.
Sorry,
wow,
that is a big one.
It's a big one to hit me right at the end. I mean, definitely sign up to the Guarantee Your Essentials campaign. That would be one. I mean, if I would like add a personal one as well, like one that I feel really passionate about is the way that you kind of think and talk about issues like poverty and the benefit system, and to actually like lift your eyes up from individuals and thinking about, you know, what is it that they might have done to get themselves into this situation, and recognise that we are in a radical environment right now, and the systems that were there 10 years ago have been really degraded, and it isn't just benefits, it's it's services, it's education, it's Sure Start centres, it's this whole ecosystem of stuff which used to be there. So like lift your eyes up from the individuals and don't blame them, and look at the systems, and sign up to the campaign.
Brilliant. Okay, well I think that's a good place to end it. So thank you, Garry, for joining us. We
It was a pleasure.
appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you ever so much.
Yeah.
I've enjoyed that.
Yeah.
I learned so much. Thank you very much. Well, this is the last episode of the HUBLIFE podcast for a few months, but we will be doing more of the HUBLIFE show over the next few Fridays, so make sure you tune in. Thanks. See you later. If you enjoyed this episode of the HUBLIFE podcast, then why not check out another one over here, or try something a little different over there.